Muy buenas tardes, estamos escuchando ahora mismo la rueda de prensa, la secretaria de prensa, Karine Jean-Pierre. Les están preguntando sobre si los fondos que está enviando Estados Unidos a Ucrania, por esas investigaciones sobre cómo se están usando esos fondos y esas investigaciones sobre corrupción hay en el país, les están preguntando si esos fondos realmente están llegando para ayudar a la guerra.
Saying that they're difficult to operate, difficult to train people on, and that was essentially what we heard from President Biden today. What changed?
So a couple of things. You're right, we've been completely open and transparent about the sophistication level of the Abrams tank. It's, as the President said, the most capable, powerful tank in the world. And a lot goes into making it the most capable tank. We've been very honest about that. There's training that's needed. There's sophisticated maintenance requirements. There's a supply chain. I mean, it uses a gas turbine engine, basically a jet engine.
Las características de esos tanques Abrams que va a enviar finalmente Estados Unidos, que hoy Biden confirmaba que finalmente se van a enviar 31 tanques Abrams, y están hablando de las características y de las complicaciones que conllevan estos tanques, tanto lo primero de su utilización, es muy compleja, lo segundo de su mantenimiento y también de su combustible.
What's changed, Kristen, are the conditions on the ground. And the kinds of fighting that the Russians are doing right now, and the kinds of fighting, more importantly, that we believe the Ukrainians are going to need to be capable of in weeks and months ahead, well into 2023, well into this year. And that's why we're doing the combined arms training outside of Ukraine for battalion-sized units. Combined arms maneuver, that's a fancy title, but basically means being able to integrate your ground capabilities, whether that's armor, artillery, even some degree small air defense systems, integrating command and control, logistics, integrating all that to fight on the ground, particularly with open terrain. That's why armored vehicles were so high on the list for the Ukrainians, and tanks are armored vehicles. So this very much just follows right along with the kinds of discussions we've been having with the Ukrainians for months about making sure that they can fight on the terrain that they're in and that they can prepare for operations going forward this year.
And just to follow up, it was part of the calculation, because obviously there had been this robust back and forth between the U.S. and Germany. Is part of this about giving cover to Germany and other European allies to allow them to send in tanks?
I wouldn't use the word cover.
Y todo esto obviamente ha sido para esa decisión final de que Estados Unidos envíe los tanques Abrams, ha sido para que el resto de compañeros europeos enviasen los tanques. Si esa maniobra por decir, oye, los tanques Abrams no son tan específicos para esta guerra de Ucrania, hemos visto las características, hemos dicho lo complejos que son de usar, además en situaciones de invierno no se comportan bien, son máquinas muy difíciles de controlar y que llevan mucho gasto de combustible, y dicen, ¿ha sido a lo mejor este movimiento estadounidense estrategia para que los aliados europeos mandasen los tanques y que Alemania decidiese mandar los Leopards?
Could you get a little more specific about how many tanks the Ukrainians would like to have? I mean, I know you're going to say it's their decision, but obviously you're communicating with them the whole time. How many they would like to have to get what they want to do done, i.e. these counter-offensives? And do you think they're going to get there with this whole hodgepodge of different Western contributions?
So you're right, I'm not going to speak for President Zelensky. I think if he was up here instead of me, he would tell you he wants as many as he can, as fast as he can. So the battalion that we're going to provide, that's 31 tanks, and that's for a Ukrainian-sized battalion. An American battalion has more tanks in it, but the way they're organized, it's about 30 to 31 tanks. And again, the Germans are going to help organize another 2 battalions, so that's about 60 more, roughly. And that's just what was talked about today. The Brits have agreed to send some of their Challenger tanks. You heard the President talk about the French and their contributions to armored vehicles. So there's a lot that's being applied to this. And armored vehicles are important. You know, you don't go after a crocodile with a cornstalk. And these vehicles, these tanks, those armored vehicles, they're going to have an effect.
Okay, but just
los 31 tanques que Estados Unidos va a enviar van a tener un efecto, que no los envían porque sí, sino porque son útiles para el campo de batalla.
Do you feel confident that the Ukrainians are going to get to where they want to be in terms of the armor for these combined arms maneuvers you talk about? That they're going to have all that kit ready?
I can go so far as to tell you that it is our goal, and a goal shared by our allies and partners, including in the phone call this morning that the President had, that we accomplish exactly that goal, that we get to Ukraine the capabilities they need to be successful on the battlefield today, but just as critically in the future, going forward this year. Because right now, I mean, it's wintertime, so the conditions are not great. There's some fighting in the Donbass, but other than that, there's not been a whole heck of a lot, at least around down in the south. But as the weather conditions improve, you can expect that the Russians are going to pick up the tempo. We have to be ready for that, and I know the Ukrainians feel they have to be ready for that. So it's about helping Ukraine defend itself, but also, as you heard the President say, helping Ukraine be able to go on the offense when the weather conditions and when the operational conditions are permissive.
Hablando básicamente de que ahora con el invierno obviamente se va a paralizar un poco todo y quiere que preparen la ofensiva una vez el invierno termine, ¿no? Y que Ucrania esté preparada. Ha dicho que ese es el objetivo, y de la llamada que ha tenido Biden esta mañana, que el objetivo gira en torno a que realmente Ucrania, que era por lo que le habían preguntado, esté preparada para volver al campo de batalla con esos tanques también y todo ese armamento una vez también el invierno empiece a aflojar.
But actually, I mean, the effort, the decision you saw today by both Germany and the United States was several weeks in the making through many discussions with the Germans and with our allies and partners. But it also, there's a military component here too, Phil. I mean, I get it. I get, where you're kind of going is these tanks are not going to get there for many months, and I understand that. But those Leopards won't take quite as long to get there as the Abrams. And we're not wasting the time. I mean, even as we procure these tanks, we're going to be, the Pentagon will very soon start doing the training for Ukrainian tankers, Ukrainian troops that man tanks, so that they can be ready to receive once those tanks are on the battlefield. Another point that's worth making is it's not just about how to operate the Abrams, to Kristen's question, it's how to maintain them, and it's how to have an organic supply chain process, a logistical sustainment process, so that you can keep them maintained and in the fight over the long haul.
That's one quick thought.
Dice que no solo se basa todo en enviar los tanques y ya está, obviamente, que requiere un proceso de entrenamiento y que el objetivo para Estados Unidos no es solo mandar los tanques, sino que se cree una cadena de suministro donde poco a poco Ucrania vaya siendo entrenada, se puedan mantener, se pueda dar suministro y también esos tanques pues, puedan tener el mantenimiento correcto, ¿no?, para llevar a cabo esa ofensiva.
And we're not dismissive. That said, these tanks are meant to help Ukraine fight effectively on open terrain, to defend their sovereignty and their territory, and to win back territory that the Russians have taken from them. And as the President said, they don't represent an offensive threat to Russia. Do they represent a threat to Russian soldiers? You bet they do, but not to Russian soldiers that are in Ukraine, not to Russia proper.
Nadia. Thank you, Kevin. Hi, John. Actually, Phil asked my question, but...
Oh, good. So we can go to the next one.
I have a follow-up on that. The expectation that these tanks will be delivered within a month, at least 4 months. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. But also the reports that the Russians might launch a counterattack now. Do you see this as a catalyst for the Russians now to launch an attack, to escalate the war in a way, to stop them before they...
Si esta decisión va a ser el catalizador para que Rusia decida escalar la guerra. A ver qué responde.
Russians and try to get inside their head and what their intents are. What we do believe, all I can tell you is what we believe, and that is that the Russians, Mr. Putin, will use the winter not only to conduct operations, which he is in Bakhmut and Soledar, but to use it to regroup, to retrain, to re-equip, and to prepare himself for continued fighting when the weather improves. So we want to make sure that we're using this time as best we can, to help the Ukrainians in the fight that they're in today, but make sure that they're ready for the fight tomorrow, that they're ready to defend themselves against whatever offensive operations the Russians might be planning to do when the weather improves. So again, I can't predict perfectly how this is going to go, but this is very much, you know, some of the criticism I've heard, and I've heard it when I was at the Pentagon too, is, you know, it's hand to mouth, and you guys aren't thinking ahead, and it's just whatever the need is for today. And this decision today is very much indicative of the President's long-term commitment to Ukraine and how he has tasked the national security team to think ahead, to plan ahead, to help the Ukrainians get ahead of what's coming down the pike.
Can I follow up on that?
Dice que no puede responder por parte de Rusia y que obviamente no sabe cómo se va a desarrollar los acontecimientos, pero que este objetivo de enviar los tanques es con un objetivo de largo plazo de poder proveer a Ucrania y obviamente ayudarles ahora en esa guerra en la que están involucrados.
Does the administration expect any operations moving forward that would include retaking Crimea or lands that were lost during the Russian invasion?
I'm not going to talk about Ukrainian operations. I would just never violate their operational security, and certainly wouldn't divulge from the podium what their plans and intentions are. I will only say this, that we do not dictate to the Ukrainians how they operate, where they operate, what missions they conduct, what targets they choose. We help them with usable information and intelligence as best we can so that they can be successful, but these are their decisions to make. It is their country, their war. Our job is to make sure that they can prosecute that war successfully.
And I want to follow up to make sure that I
Recalca básicamente que ellos no deciden por los ucranianos en cuanto a qué operaciones hacer, cómo operar y cómo llevar a cabo esta guerra, ya que ha recalcado que es su guerra, pero que Estados Unidos, pues por así decirlo, provee en todo lo que puede en tema de armamento y ayuda, pero que no decide, que decide Ucrania.
The number of tanks it's providing, 31. That's
Yeah.
a very specific number.
I kind of got to it a little earlier. It's basically the size of a Ukrainian tank battalion. In America, I'm getting a little bit astray of my knowledge. I was a naval officer, but as I understand it, an American tank battalion has about 50 tanks in it, and it's organized with more companies to comprise a battalion than in Ukraine. It's just the way the Ukrainian army is organized. It's not right or wrong. It's just that their battalions are basically, I believe, 2 companies, so they're just smaller. And so 2 companies, that's about 15 tanks a company, and that's how you get to 30, 31. And then, you know, usually at least one of these tanks is the commander's in there, and so you've got a command and control tank that sort of is in charge of how they're operating on the field. And now I'm really going astray of my expertise, but I think that's about as far as I can go.
The Ukrainians said today, thank you very much, now how about some 4th generation fighter jets? What are the chances of that happening?
We're in constant discussions with the Ukrainians about their capabilities, and as I've said, we evolve those as the conditions change. Can't blame the Ukrainians for wanting more and more systems. It's not the first time that they've talked about fighter jets, but I don't have any announcements to make on that front.
Go ahead, Christina.
Is there concern that if any of these tanks were to fall in Russian hands, they would have access to the latest U.S. technology?
There's always what we call tech transfer concerns, I mean, that would be the case with other systems that we have provided to Ukraine. But, and this doesn't, kind of gets to the corruption question, but not really. We just haven't seen any indications that any of the material that we have provided Ukraine isn't being stored appropriately, used appropriately, maintained appropriately, and being fought with appropriately. We're just not seeing that happen. But is that a potential risk? It's always a risk in war. It's a risk when we fight a war. But that's why we're working so closely with the Ukrainians on accountability, and we've really increased our efforts through the Defense Attaché's office in Kyiv to work with the Ukrainians on accountability, so that we have a better sight picture on where these things are at any given time. But it's a war, and you can't forget that. I mean, it's a war.
Thanks, Grant. John, why not take the Abrams out of existing stocks to get them there faster? Is there a reason that you want more training before that happens, or is there some U.S. need that you want to keep
The
that
Pentagon
in storage?
assesses that they don't have any excess Abrams in their inventory, that all of them are gainfully employed, if you will, for our own national security defense. And even if there were excess tanks, the process of getting them to Ukraine to prepare them for use by the Ukrainians, to train Ukrainians, to put all the parts and supplies in place would take many months anyway. So it's not like this procurement process is really costing us any time than if we just drew them down out of our own stocks. But the real reason is we just don't have them, we don't have excess tanks. The second thing is, and this is not unimportant, is that, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, when they get there, we want to make sure that they fall on ready hands and that the Ukrainians know how to use them, they know how to keep them running, and they've got the supply chain in place for spare parts and supplies and anything else they need, so that they can be more effective on the battlefield.
And given the process, what's the soonest?
En cuanto al tiempo de entrega de estos tanques, se ha dicho que, bueno, que aunque entregasen sus propios tanques estadounidenses, que lo primero, que no tienen exceso, y que lo segundo, tardaría el mismo tiempo, porque aún así el tiempo que requieren es de instalar, como bien había dicho antes, esa cadena de suministro, ¿no? Esa cadena donde tanto tengan esa formación los ucranianos como sepan operarlos, como estén los tanques preparados para poder servir en Ucrania. Entonces, bueno, todavía no tenemos la fecha clara cuánto va a ser el tiempo que se tarde en enviar, pero ahí vemos cómo responden que aunque enviasen sus tanques, dice que el proceso sería igual de largo.
Tanks from the West. So is that a realistic number? If not now, maybe in the future, if the Ukrainians should happen to prove that they can absorb these initial tranche of tanks and they can maintain it?
I don't think it's wise to get ahead of where we are right now. We are focused on working on this program to get them, procure them, these 31 Abrams tanks, to include all the supplies and parts that go with it and the training that's required to operate and maintain them. And we know, certainly based on the conversation the President had this morning, that our allies and partners in Europe are likewise focused now on moving additional armored capability to include these now German Leopard tanks in a shorter period of time.
To be clear, the future shipments of tanks is not off the table.
We're focused on the announcement the President just made today.
Just one more really quickly. He also said that the next step for Ukrainians will be to request extended range missiles. Is that also under consideration?
We are in constant conversation with the Ukrainians about their capabilities. I don't have any announcements to make.
With many months being the time frame, is it fair to say that these tanks will not be available for use for the spring offensive? And secondly, one of the concerns in the lead-up in the debate about this was fuel concerns. How is that being dealt with?
El consumo de energía de estos tanques. Importante esto.
Which needs jet fuel. So there's a specific type of fuel that powers the Abrams, and we've got to make sure that that pipeline, literally and figuratively, is available to Ukraine. So that's going to take some time as well. And look, I'm not going to predict date certain on the calendar. It's going to take many months before the tanks get there. And let's not get ahead of specific spring offensives. We do think as the weather improves, the Russians are going to want to increase their tempo. We want to make sure that the Ukrainians can not only meet that tempo, but be capable of their own. And what that looks like and when that starts or where, that's really up to President Zelensky and his military advisors. We wouldn't speak to that. Only thing I'd add to that, Amr, is that these Leopard tanks won't take quite as long to get on the ground. And again, I'll let the Germans speak to this, but they won't take the same length of time that the Abrams will. In order to arrive.
Recuerden que los Abrams utilizan combustible para aviones y obviamente también vuelven a recalcar el tema del tiempo. Dice que obviamente el tema de proveer también del combustible para utilizar estos tanques Abrams, pues que recuerden, de hecho, consumen unos 7 litros de combustible, 60 toneladas de litros por combustible por kilómetro, ¿no? Entonces nos dice que básicamente va a tardar más tiempo, que Biden ya ha dicho que lo que ha recalcado antes en cuanto al tiempo, pero que será antes de lo que la gente prevé.
And long term. And the decision that the President announced today was the result of a lot of conversations with the Ukrainians as well as with our allies and partners. And it is very much, as I answered before, it's very much about forecasting. It's about trying to get ahead of the kinds of fighting that we see coming in coming months here in the spring and the summer of this year.
Can I ask one quick follow-up, and to broaden it out actually beyond the situation in Russia and Ukraine? I was struck by something the President said today about ensuring that neighbors cannot steal other neighbors' territory. It's something you all have brought up many, many times. And I'm curious if you can kind of help us understand why the administration has not changed course on your predecessor, former President Donald Trump's position on the Golan Heights. And what makes that situation distinct from what's going on in Russia and Ukraine?
Look, the different scenarios completely, and I'm not here prepared to talk much about that, except to say we've been very consistent that we want to see a two-state solution, and we believe, the president believes, that a two-state solution is possible and could be viable, but it takes both sides to be willing to commit to that, and we don't want to see either side take unilateral actions that would decrease the possibility of actually reaching a two-state solution.
Could you please bring us a little bit behind the scenes about the negotiations?
You're behind her. I couldn't see it.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could give us some details about the negotiations behind the scenes with the Europeans.
You want me to talk behind the scenes at the podium?
Yeah, a little bit. Especially what type of conversations have there been with the European Union and with the government of Spain?
The discussions have been very robust with our European allies and partners.
Discusiones con los miembros de la Unión Europea y sobre todo con España también.
With his counterparts in the UK, France, Germany, and Italy, was again very productive, very candid. All these leaders are rightly focused on doing what they can to help Ukraine, and rightly focused on the future. I can't speak for Spanish decision-making here. Spain obviously has been a contributor and a supporter of Ukraine, and that's always welcome, and I think the President addressed some of their contributions today, and we look forward to continuing to work closely with Spain going forward.
James, in the back.
Seguimos buscando colaborar con España en los próximos meses, ¿no? Y en los próximos años.
Question, James? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
Can we just have this for the record?
Oh my goodness, yes. I'm going to frame that transcript. Holy mackerel.
This is simply a tribute to your own loquacity and thoroughness in briefing us.
Loquacity is James Rosen for eloquence? Is that?
I have two questions for you.
All right, go ahead, sir.
So we don't know yet how Russia will respond, but if Moscow chooses a major escalation and decides to strike NATO, either Poland or the Baltics, do you have enough troops in the region right now to respond? And from day one, not 5 months ahead. And the second question would be, many of those who called for sending Leopards and Abrams to Ukraine argued that Russia right now is militarily too weakened to respond conventionally in a significant way. How confident are you in this assessment that Russia is so weak that, or maybe you have a different assessment, but many people think that Russia is too weak to respond in a significant way to the move that was just announced about tanks?
Let me take the second one first. There's no question that Russia's military is weaker today than it was 11 months ago. When you talk about the resources and the casualties that they have sunk into this unprovoked war of theirs, and the literally thousands of missiles and rockets.
La fortaleza del ejército ruso a día de hoy y de si tiene capacidad de responder con una forma todavía superior en cuanto Occidente ha decidido enviar estos tanques hacia Ucrania. Y dice que por ahora cree que Rusia, el ejército de Rusia es más débil de lo que lo era hace 11 meses. Vamos a seguir escuchando.
You don't have to look very far. Just the news coverage to see that the Russian military and their thugs are still pretty lethal, because Ukrainians continue to die every day. And so I think if you were to ask a Ukrainian here, how weak is Russia, I don't think that they would tell you that there's not still fight left there. And that's why we're so focused on making sure that Ukraine can continue to defend itself and to have the capabilities to fight back and to succeed on the battlefield. On your first question, all I can tell you is we have seen absolutely no indication that Mr. Putin has designs on striking NATO territory. And President Biden has said since the very beginning of this conflict that we take our Article 5 commitments to NATO seriously. Article 5, of course, is the notion that an attack on one is an attack on all. And we take that seriously. In fact, we take it so seriously that President Biden ordered an additional 20,000 American troops alone onto the European continent, and they still are there. Now, we'll be rotating them in and out, but it'll the net number of 100,000 American troops on the European continent has stayed the same and will stay the same for the foreseeable future. Make no mistake, the security environment in Europe has changed. Not is changing, not will change. It has changed because of what Mr. Putin did. And the United States anteed up for that and made clear to our NATO allies, particularly on the eastern flank, how seriously we take our responsibilities to those Article 5 commitments. And Mr. Putin needs to understand that.
But do you have enough troops? Because many of those countries send its own tanks, missile systems to Ukraine.
Well, we're sending missile systems, and now we're sending tanks to Ukraine as well. Every nation is making these decisions as best they can to support.
Sobre si tienen tropas suficientes en caso de que Rusia quiera escalar más allá y si la OTAN podría protegerse en Europa sobre estas posibles escaladas. Y responde que sí, que Europa está mucho mejor preparada de lo que lo estaba antes de la invasión.
The talent, the manpower, the resources to meet our Article 5 commitments to our NATO allies.
Are there any signs of a nuclear threat?
Thank you, Korean John. Got two questions about China. First, Korean told us yesterday that the U.S. has been communicating with China about the implications of helping Russia. Can you tell us what China's response was to the U.S. communication, and if China continues to provide economic support, and including by selling non-lethal military aid to Russia, would the U.S. impose stronger measures than just communicate?
I won't get ahead of decisions that haven't been made, and I'm certainly not going to detail diplomatic conversations. We've been very clear publicly, and we certainly have been clear in private settings with Chinese leaders that we don't believe that now is the time for business as usual with Russia, and that we want to see every nation sign up to the strict sanctions regime and abide by those sanctions, meet those sanctions, and do nothing to support Russia. Now, every country makes their decisions for themselves, just like I said before, you know, and China's going to have choices that they're going to have to continue to make here about what side they want to be on. We know they're still buying Russian oil, for instance, and it's not clear, you know, whether they will abide by the cap. But this is the time for the international community, and you're seeing so much of it today in this decision, to really continue to rally around Ukraine and to make the right decisions.
Follow up on China, sorry. So China's been saying that there's 70,000 COVID deaths in just over a month, up from just a dozen reported earlier this month. Does the U.S. believe that new number by the Chinese government, saying that there's been 70,000?
The Chinese, we have continued to encourage the Chinese to be cooperative with international reviews and studies about COVID, and they have not been fully transparent, and we cannot speak to the veracity of those numbers. We urge China to be fully transparent about what's going on.
Sorry,
I think, ma'am, I gotta move on.
I appreciate it. We all have questions. If back to the timeline, if I may, you saying repeatedly today that it's going to take many months for all these tanks to be delivered. Taking a step back, should Americans see that?
Siguen con preguntas sobre China y otros temas relacionados. Ya hemos visto esas respuestas que se enfocaban sobre el envío de los tanques Abrams a Ucrania por parte de Estados Unidos. Nosotros nos vamos a publicidad y ahora arrancamos con el